traveling through another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. Next stop, the Twilight Zone.
Harper Audio presents The Midnight Sun by Rod Serling, performed by Lois Nettleton. The secret of a successful artist, an old instructor had told her years ago, is not just to put paint on canvas. It is to transfer emotion, using oils and brush as a kind of nerve conduit. Norma Smith looked out of the window at the giant sun, and then back to the canvas on the easel she had set up close to the window. She had tried to paint the sun, and she had captured some of it physically, the vast yellow-white orb which seemed to cover half the sky, and already its imperfect edges could be defined. It was rimmed by massive flames in motion. This motion was on her canvas, but the heat, the incredible broiling heat that came in waves and baked the city outside, could not be painted, nor could it be described. It bore no relation to any known quantity. It simply had no precedent. It was a prolonged, increasing, and deadening fever that traveled the streets like an invisible fire. The girl put the paintbrush down and went slowly across the room to a small refrigerator. She got out a milk bottle full of water and carefully measured some into a glass. She took one swallow and felt its coolness move through her. For the past week, just the simple act of drinking carried with it very special reactions. She couldn't remember actually feeling water before. Before, it had simply been thirst and then alleviation. But now, the mere swallow of anything cool was an experience by itself. She put the bottle back inside the refrigerator and looked briefly at the clock on the bookcase. It read 11:45. She heard footsteps coming down the stairs outside, and she walked slowly over to the door, opened it, and went out into the hall. A little 4-year-old girl stared up at her soberly, her eyes fixed on Norma's glass of water. Norma knelt down and put the glass to the child's lips. "Susie!" a man's voice cut in. "Don't take the lady's water." Norma looked up at a tall, sweat-drenched man in an unbuttoned sports shirt. "That's all right, Mr. Schuster," Norma said. "I have plenty." "Nobody has plenty," the man said as he reached the bottom of the stairs and moved the little girl aside. "There's no such thing as plenty anymore." He took the little girl's hand and crossed the hall to knock on the opposite door. "Mrs. Bronson," he called. "We're leaving now." Mrs. Bronson opened the door and stepped out. She was a middle-aged woman in a thin housecoat, her face gleaming with sweat. She looked frowsy and dumpy, although Norma could recollect that she had been a petite, rather pretty woman not too long ago, much younger looking than her years. Now her face was tired, her hair stringy and unkempt. "Did you get gas?" Mrs. Bronson inquired in a flat, tired voice. The tall man nodded. "I got 12 gallons. I figured that'd take us at least to Buffalo." "Where are you going?" Norma asked. The tall man's wife came down the stairs. "We're trying to get to Toronto," she said. "Mr. Schuster has a cousin there." Mrs. Bronson reached down to stroke the little girl's hair, and then wiped some of the perspiration from the tiny, flushed face. "I'm not sure it's wise, you trying to do this. The highways are packed, bumper to bumper," the radio said, "even with the gas shortage and everything." Schuster cut her off. "I know that," he said tersely, "but we gotta try anyway." He wet his lips. "We just wanted to say goodbye to you, Mrs. Bronson. We've enjoyed living here. You've been real kind." Then, somehow embarrassed, he turned quickly to his wife. "Let's go, honey." He picked up the single suitcase and, holding his little daughter's hand, started down the steps. His wife followed. "Good luck," Mrs. Bronson called down to them. "Safe trip." Goodbye, Mrs. Bronson, the woman's voice called back. The front door opened and closed. Mrs. Bronson stared down the steps for a long moment, then turned to Norma. "And now we are two," she said softly. "They were the last?" Norma asked, pointing to the steps. "The last. Building's empty now, except for you and me." A man carrying a toolkit came out of Mrs. Bronson's apartment. "She's running again, Mrs. Bronson," he said. "I wouldn't sign no guarantee as to how long she'll run, but she shouldn't give you any trouble for a while." He looked briefly at Norma and fingered his toolkit nervously. "Was he going to pay for this in cash?" he asked. "I have a charge account," Mrs. Bronson said. The repairman was ill at ease. "Boss said I should start collecting in cash." He looked a little apologetically toward Norma. "We've been working round the clock. Refrigerator's breaking down every minute and a half. Everybody and his brother trying to make ice. Then with the current being cut off every couple hours, it's tough on the machines." With obvious effort, he looked back at Mrs. Bronson. "About that bill, Mrs. Bronson." "How much is it?" The repairman looked down at his toolkit. His voice was low. "I gotta charge you $100. He just shook his head disconsolately. The quiet of Mrs. Bronson's voice did not cover her dismay. $100? For 15 minutes' work?" The repairman nodded miserably. "For 15 minutes' work. Most outfits are charging double that, and even triple. It's been that way for a month, ever since..." He looked out the hall window toward the street. "Ever since the thing happened." There was an embarrassing silence, and finally Mrs. Bronson took off her wedding ring. "I don't have any money left," she said quietly, "but this is gold. It's worth a lot." She held the ring out to him. The repairman failed to meet her eyes. He made a jerky, spasmodic motion that was neither acceptance nor rejection. Then he looked at the ring and shook his head. "Go ahead and charge it," he said, keeping his face averted. "I ain't taking a lady's wedding ring." He went over to the stairs. "Bye, Mrs. Bronson. Good luck to you." He paused at the top of the stairs. The yellow-white sun was framed in the window above him. It was constant now, but somehow an evil thing that could no longer be ignored. "I'm gonna try to get my family out tonight," the repairman said, staring out the window. "Driving north. Canada, if we can make it. They say it's cooler there." He turned to look back toward the two women. "Not that it makes much difference, just kind of prolonging it." He smiled, but it was a twisted smile. "Like everybody rushing to fix their refrigerators and air conditioners." He shook his head. "It's nuts. It's just prolonging it, that's all." He started slowly down the steps. His big shoulders slumped. "Oh, Christ," they heard him say as he turned at the landing and went down again. "Christ, it's hot." His footsteps crossed the downstairs hall. Norma leaned against the side of the door. "What happens now?" she asked. Mrs. Bronson shrugged. "I don't know. I heard on the radio that they'd only turn the water on for an hour a day from now on. They said they'd announce what time." She suddenly stared at Norma. "Aren't you gonna leave?" she blurted. Norma shook her head. "No, I'm not gonna leave." She forced a smile, then turned and went back into her apartment, leaving the door open. Mrs. Bronson followed her. Norma walked over to the window. The sun bathed her with its heat and with its strange, almost malevolent light. It had changed the entire city. The streets, the buildings, the stores had taken on a sickly oyster color. The air was heavy, soggy. Norma felt perspiration rolling down her back and her legs. "I keep getting this crazy thought," she said. "This crazy thought that I'll wake up and none of this will have happened. I'll wake up in a cool bed, and it'll be night outside, and there'll be a wind, and there'll be branches rustling, shadows on the sidewalk, a moon. She turned her face to stare directly out of the window. It was like standing in front of an open oven. The waves of heat struck at her, pushed into her flesh, poured through her pores. And traffic noises, she continued in a softer voice. Automobiles, garbage cans, milk bottles, voices. She raised her hand and pulled at the cord of the Venetian blind. The slats closed and the room became shadowed, but the heat remained. Norma closed her eyes. "Isn't it odd," she said reflectively, "isn't it odd, the things we took for granted while we had them?" Mrs. Bronson's hands were like two nervous little birds fluttering. "There was a scientist on the radio," she said, forcing herself to be conversational. "I heard him this morning. He said that it would get a lot hotter, more each day, now that we're moving so close to the sun. And that's why we're... Her voice trailed off. She couldn't bring herself to say the word. She didn't want to hear it aloud. The word was doomed. But unspoken or not, it hung there in the still, hot air. It was just 4.5 weeks ago that the Earth suddenly, inexplicably, changed its elliptical orbit and began to follow a path which gradually, moment by moment, day by day, took it closer to the sun. Midnight became almost as hot as noon and almost as light. There was no more darkness, no more night. All of man's little luxuries, the air conditioners, the refrigerators, the electric fans that stirred up the air, they were no longer luxuries. They were pitiful and panicky keys to temporary survival. New York City was like a giant, sick animal, slowly mummifying, its juices boiling away. It had emptied itself of its inhabitants. They had trekked north toward Canada in a hopeless race against a sun which had already begun to overtake them. It was a world of heat. Each day the sun appeared larger and larger, and each day heat was added to heat until thermometers boiled over, and breathing, talking, moving came with agony. It was a world of a perpetual high noon. It was the next afternoon, and Norma walked up the steps carrying a heavy bag of groceries. A can and some wilted carrots protruded from the top. She stopped on the landing between 2 floors and caught her breath. Her light cotton dress clung to her like a wet glove. "Norma?" Mrs. Bronson's voice called out. "Is that you, honey?" Norma's voice was weak and breathless. "Yes, Mrs. Bronson." She started up the steps again as the landlady came out of her apartment and looked at the bag in Norma's arms. "The store was open?" Norma half smiled. "Wide open. I think that's the first time in my life I've been sorry I was born a woman." She put the bag on the floor and pointed to it. "That's all I was strong enough to carry. There weren't any clerks, just a handful of people taking all they could grab." She smiled again and picked up the bag. "At least we won't starve. And there are 3 cans of fruit juice on the bottom." Mrs. Bronson followed her into her apartment. "Fruit juice?" She clapped her hands together like a little child, her voice excited. "Oh, Norma, could we open one now?" Norma turned to her, smiled at her gently, and patted her cheek. "Of course we can." She started to empty the bag while Mrs. Bronson kept opening and closing drawers in the kitchen area. "Where is the can opener?" Norma pointed to the far drawer on the left. "In there, Mrs. Bronson." The The landlady's fingers trembled with excitement as she opened up the drawer, rummaged through its interior, and finally pulled out a can opener. She carried it over to Norma and abruptly grabbed a can out of the girl's hand. And then, her hands shaking, she tried to get the point of the opener firmly into the can, breathing heavily and spasmodically as she did so. Can and opener fell from her fingers and landed on the floor. She dropped to her hands and knees, emitting a childlike wail, and then suddenly bit her lip and closed her eyes. "Oh, my God," she whispered. "I'm acting like some kind of an animal. Oh, Norma, I'm so sorry." Norma knelt beside her and picked up the can and the opener. "You're acting like a frightened woman," she said quietly. "You should have seen me in that store, Mrs. Bronson. Running down the aisles. I mean running. This way and that way, knocking over things, grabbing and throwing away, then grabbing again." She smiled and shook her head, and then got to her feet. "And at that," she continued, "I think I was the calmest person in the store. One woman just stood in the center of the room and cried. Just cried like a baby. Kept pleading for someone to help her." Norma shook her head again, wanting to obliterate the scene from her mind. A small radio on the coffee table suddenly lit up and began to hum. After a while, there came the voice of an announcer. It was deep and resonant, but somehow sounded strange. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice said, "this is station WNYG. We are remaining on the air for 1 hour to bring you traffic advisories and other essential news. First, a bulletin from the Office of Civil Defense. Traffic moving north and east out of New York City. Motorists are advised to remain off the highways until further notice. Traffic on the Garden State Parkway, the Merritt Parkway, and the New York State Thruway heading north is reported bumper to bumper, stretching out in some places to upwards of 50 miles. Please remain off the highways until further notice." There was a pause, and the voice took on a different tone. "And now today's weather report from the Director of Meteorology. The temperature at 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time was 117 degrees. Humidity 97%, barometer steady. Forecast for tomorrow." Another pause, and the tone changed again. "Forecast for tomorrow." There was a long silence as Norma and Mrs. Bronson stared toward the radio. Then the announcer's voice came on once more. "Hot. More of the same, only hotter." The sound of whispered voices came from the radio. "I don't care," the announcer said clearly. "Who the hell do they think they're kidding with this weather report crap? Ladies and gentlemen," he went on, a strange kind of laughter in his voice, "tomorrow you can fry eggs on the sidewalks, heat up soup in the ocean, and get yourselves the sunburn of your lives just by standing in the goddamn shade." This time the whispered voices were more urgent and intense, and the announcer was obviously reacting to them. "What do you mean, panic?" he blurted out. "Who the hell is there left to panic?" There came the sound of grim laughter. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice continued, "I'm told that my departing from the script might panic you. It happens to be my contention that there aren't a dozen of you left in this city who are listening to me. I'm starting a special contest now. Anybody within sound of my voice can tear off the top of their thermometer and send it to me. I'll send them my own specially devised booklet on how to stay warm when the sun is out at midnight. Now, maybe I can find a couple of real pizzazz commercials for you. How about a nice cold beer? Wouldn't that taste just great?" The voice faded off slightly. "Let me alone," it said. "Do you hear me? God damn it, let me alone. Let go of me." More frantic whisperings followed. And then a dead silence, finally replaced by the sound of a needle scratching on a record, and then the sound of dance music. Norma and Mrs. Bronson exchanged a look. "You see," Norma said as she started to open up the can of grapefruit juice, "you're not the only frightened one." She unbuttoned the top buttons of her dress then took 2 glasses down from a shelf and poured the juice into them. She handed one of the glasses to Mrs. Bronson, who looked at it but didn't drink. "Go ahead, Mrs. Bronson," Norma said softly. "It's grapefruit juice." The older woman looked down at the floor and very slowly put the glass down on the counter. "I can't," she said. "I just can't live off you, Norma. You'll need this yourself." Norma moved over to her swiftly and held her tightly by her shoulders. "We're going to have to start living off of each other, Mrs. Bronson." She picked up the glass and handed it to the landlady, then winked at her and held up her own glass. "Here's looking at you." Mrs. Bronson made a valiant attempt at a smile and a wink of her own, but as she put the glass to her lips, she had to stifle a sob and almost gagged as she swallowed. The music on the radio went off abruptly, and a small electric fan at the end of the room stopped its desultory movement to left and right, the blades coming to a halt like some tired, aged airplane. "The current's off again," Norma said quietly. Mrs. Bronson nodded. "Every day it stays on for a shorter time. What if—" she began, and she turned away. "What?" Norma said softly. "What if it shuts off and doesn't come back on again? It would be like an oven in here. As hot as it is now is unbearable. It would be so much worse." She put her hands to her mouth. "Norma, it would be so much worse." Norma didn't answer her. Mrs. Bronson drank a little more of the grapefruit juice and put the glass down. She walked around the room aimlessly, looking at the paintings that lined the room. And there was something so hopeless in the round, perspiring face, the eyes so terribly frightened, that Norma wanted to take her into her arms. "Norma," Mrs. Bronson said, staring at one of the paintings. Norma moved closer to her. "Paint something different today. Paint something like a scene with a waterfall and trees bending in the wind. Paint something cool." Suddenly, her tired face became a mask of anger. She seized the painting, lifted it up, and then threw it down on the floor. "Damn it, Norma!" she screamed. "Don't paint the sun anymore." She knelt down and began to cry. Norma looked at the ripped canvas lying in front of her. It was the painting she'd been working on, a partially finished oil of the street outside, with the hot, white sun hovering overhead. The jagged tear across the picture gave it a strangely surrealistic look, something Dolly might have done. The old woman's sobs finally subsided, but she stayed on her knees, her head down. Norma gently touched her shoulder. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "tomorrow, I'll try to paint a waterfall." Mrs. Bronson reached up to take Norma's hand and held onto it tightly. She shook her head. Her voice was a hoarse whisper. "Oh, Norma, I'm sorry. My dear child, I'm so sorry. It would be so much better if what? If I were to just die." She looked up into Norma's face. "So much better for you." Norma knelt down, cupping the old face in her hands. "Don't ever say that again to me, Mrs. Bronson. For God's sake, don't ever say that again. We need each other now. We need each other desperately."
This concludes side 1. Please fast forward the tape to the end and turn it over.
Mrs. Bronson let her cheek rest on Norma's hand, and then slowly got to her feet. A policeman came up the stairs and appeared at the open door. His shirt was unbuttoned, his sleeves had been cut off and were ragged and uneven at the elbows. He looked from Norma to Mrs. Bronson and wiped the sweat off his sunburned face. "You the only ones in the building?" he asked. "Just me and Miss Smith," Mrs. Bronson answered. "You had your radio on lately?" the policeman asked. "It's on all the time," Mrs. Bronson said, and turned to Norma. "Norma, honey, what station did we—" The policeman interrupted. "Doesn't make any difference. There are only 2 or 3 on the air now, and they figure by tomorrow there won't be any. The point is, we've been trying to get a public announcement through for everyone left in the city." He looked from one face to the other, and then around the room, obviously reluctant to go on. "There isn't going to be a police force tomorrow. We're disbanding. Over half of us have gone already. A few volunteered to stay back and tell everyone we could that—" He saw the fear creep into Mrs. Bronson's face, and he tried to make his voice steady. "Best thing would be to keep your doors locked from now on. Every wild man, every crank and maniac around will be roaming the streets. It's not going to be safe, ladies, so keep your doors locked." He looked at them and made a mental note that Norma was the stronger of the two and the more reliable. "You got any weapons in here, miss?" he asked, directing the question to her. "No," Norma answered. "No, I haven't." The policeman looked thoughtful for a moment and then unbuckled his holster, removing a police .45. He handed it to Norma. "You better hang on to this. It's loaded." He forced a smile toward the landlady. "Good luck to you." He turned and started down the steps, Mrs. Bronson following him. "Officer," she said, her voice shaking. "Officer, what's going to happen to us?" The policeman turned to her from halfway down the steps. His face was tired, drained out. "Don't you know?" he asked quietly. "It's just going to get hotter and hotter. Then maybe a couple of days from now," he shrugged, 4 or 5 at the most, "it'll be too hot to stand it." He looked over Mrs. Bronson's shoulder at Norma standing in the door, still holding on to the gun. His mouth was a grim, straight line. "Then you use your own judgment, ladies." He turned and continued down the steps. It was the following day, or night, The current had gone off, and with it the clocks, so that the normal measurement of time was no longer operative. A sick white light bathed the streets, and chronology had warped with the heat. Norma lay on the couch in her slip, feeling the waves of heat like massive woolen blankets piled on top of her. It was as if someone were pushing her into a vat of boiling mud, forcing the stuff into her mouth, her nose, her eyes, gradually immersing her in it. Between the nightmare of sleep and the nightmare of reality, she groaned. After a moment, she opened her eyes, feeling a dull, throbbing ache in her temples. She forced herself to rise from the couch, feeling the same ponderous heaviness as she walked across the room to the refrigerator. She opened the door, took out the milk bottle full of water, and poured herself a quarter of a glass. This she sipped slowly as she retraced her steps across the room to the window. She gasped as her hands touched the sill. It was like touching hot steel. Her fingers went to her mouth, and she stood there licking them, and finally she poured a few drops of water from the glass onto them. She listened for sounds, but there was absolute stillness. At last she turned and crossed the room, opened the door, and went out into the hall. She knocked on the door of Mrs. Bronson's apartment. "Mrs. Bronson?" she called. There was no answer. "Mrs. Bronson?" There were slow footsteps behind the door, and then the sound of a door chain. The door opened a few inches, and Mrs. Bronson peered out. "Are you all right?" Norma asked. The landlady unhooked the chain and opened the door. Her face looked pinched and ill, her eyes watery and too bright. "I'm all right," she said. "It's been so quiet, I haven't heard a sound." She moved out into the hall and looked over the landing toward the steps. "What time is it?" Norma glanced at her watch and shook her wrist. "It stopped. I'm not sure what time it is. I'm not even sure whether it's morning or night." "I think it's about 3:00 in the afternoon," Mrs. Bronson said. "It feels about 3 in the afternoon." She shook her head. "I think that's what time it is." She closed her eyes very tightly. "I lay down for a while," she went on. "I tried shutting the curtains to keep the light out, but it gets so stifling when the curtains are shut." She smiled wanly. "I guess that's psychological, isn't it? I mean, I don't think there's much difference between out there and in here." From up on the roof came the sound of glass breaking, and then a loud thump. Mrs. Bronson's hand shot out and grabbed Norma. "What was that?" she whispered. Something fell." "Oh, no, it was someone." Norma looked up the steps leading to the top floor. "Didn't you lock the roof door?" she whispered, feeling a nightmare moving in on her. "Yes," Mrs. Bronson said hurriedly, then clapped a hand to her mouth. "No," she corrected herself and shook her head wildly. "I don't know. I don't remember. I thought I did." A door above them squeaked open, and Norma didn't wait to hear any more. She took Mrs. Bronson by the arm and pulled her into her apartment, slamming the door and locking it. The two women barely breathed as the sound of footsteps came down the stairs. They stopped outside. Mrs. Bronson turned to Norma. Her mouth opened as if ready to say something, but Norma clamped her hand over it and warned her with her eyes to be silent. There was the sound of movement in the hall, and footsteps came to the door. "Hey!" a man's voice called out. "Who's in there? Somebody in there?" Norma felt all the muscles in her body constrict. Neither of them made a sound. "Come on out," the voice said.
I know you're in there. Come on out and be friendly.
The voice sounded impatient.
Come on. I ain't got all day. You come out or I'm going to come in.
Norma, her hand still on Mrs. Bronson's mouth, looked desperately around the room. She saw the policeman's gun on the coffee table, moved over and picked it up. She went to the door and held the gun close to the keyhole. She cocked it and then put her face against the door.
Did you hear that?
She asked in a loud voice. That was a gun. Now get out of here. Go down the steps and go out the front door. Leave us alone. Heavy breathing sounded on the other side of the door. Whoever was out there was thinking it over very carefully.
Okay, honey,
the voice finally said.
I never argue with a lady who has a gun.
Shuffling footsteps started down the stairs, and Norma moved quickly to the window, craning her neck so that she could see the front steps below. She waited, but no one came out of the building. I don't think he went down the stairs, she started to say, and then, hearing the click of a key, she whirled around to see Mrs. Bronson opening the door. Mrs. Bronson, she cried, wait a minute! The door was pushed open and a man stood there, a hulking, heavy-featured giant of a man in a torn undershirt, his face and body grimy. Mrs. Bronson screamed and started to rush past him. He caught her by the arm and threw her aside. Norma held up the gun, clawing at it, trying to find the trigger. The man lashed out, knocking the gun aside, and backhanded her across the face. Norma was stunned by the jolting pain. The man kicked the gun across the floor, then walked over and put his foot on it. He stood there, breathing heavily, looking from one to the other.
Crazy dames! It's too hot to play games. It's too damn hot.
He reached down and picked up the gun, then looked around the room. He saw the refrigerator and went over to it. One bottle of water was left in it, and he smiled with relief as he took it out. He threw his head back and drank, the water running out the corners of his mouth and dripping down the front of him. When he had finished the bottle, he threw it to one side, where it broke on the floor with incredible loudness. He walked slowly across the room, still holding the gun, and looked at the pictures, studying them carefully. He looked at Norma and pointed to one of the paintings.
You do this?
He asked. Norma nodded, not daring to speak.
You're good,
the man said.
You paint real good. My wife used to paint.
The terror overflowed from Mrs. Bronson.
Please,
she moaned.
Please leave us alone. We didn't do you any harm. Please.
The man just stared at her, as if her voice came from far away. He turned, looked at the painting again, and then down at the gun, as if he had suddenly become aware of it. Very slowly he lowered it, until it hung loosely from his hand, and then he dropped it to the floor. His mouth twitched, and his eyes kept blinking. He went over to the couch and sat down.
My wife,
he said.
My wife was having her baby. She was in the hospital. Then this...
He motioned toward the window.
This thing happened. She was so fragile, just a little thing.
He held out his hands again, as if groping for the right words.
She couldn't take the heat. They tried to keep her cool, but she couldn't take the heat. The baby didn't live more than an hour, and then she followed him.
His head went down, and when he looked up again, his eyes were wet.
I'm not a housebreaker. I'm a decent man. I swear to you, I'm a decent man. It's just that, well, this heat, this terrible heat. And all morning long I've been walking around the streets trying to find some water.
His eyes pleaded for understanding, and underneath the dirty sweat, his face suddenly looked young and frightened.
I didn't mean to do you any harm, honest. I wouldn't hurt you. Would you believe it?
He laughed.
I was scared of you. Yeah, that's right. I was just as scared of you as you were of me.
He rose from the couch and started across the room, his foot hitting a fragment of the broken glass from the bottle. He looked down at it.
I'm sorry about that,
he said.
I'm just off my rocker. I was just so thirsty.
He moved toward the door past Mrs. Bronson. He held out a hand to her. It was a gesture that was almost supplication.
Please forgive me, will you? Will you please forgive me?
He went to the door and leaned against the frame for a moment, the sweat pouring down his face.
Why doesn't it end?
He said in a low voice, almost unintelligible.
Why don't we just burn up?
He turned to them.
I wish it would end. That's all that's left now. Just have it end.
He went out. When Norma heard the front door close, she went over to Mrs. Bronson, helped her to her feet, and cradled her head in her arms, petting her like a mother. "I've got a surprise for you," she said. "Mrs. Bronson, listen to me. I've got a surprise for you." She went across the room and pulled out a canvas from a group of others. She turned it around and held it in front of her. It was a hurriedly done waterfall scene, obviously rough work and painted with desperation. Mrs. Bronson looked at it for a long moment and slowly smiled.
It's beautiful, Norma. I've seen waterfalls like that. There's one near Ithaca, New York. It's the highest waterfall in this part of the country, and I love the sound of it.
She went over to the canvas and touched it.
That clear water tumbling over the rocks, that wonderful clear water.
Suddenly she stopped and looked up, her eyes wide.
Did you hear it?
She asked. Norma stared at her.
Don't you hear it, Norma? Oh, it's a wonderful sound. It's so cool. It's so clear.
She kept listening as she walked across the room to the window.
Oh, Norma,
she said, her smile now a vapid, dreamy thing.
It's lovely. Oh, it's just lovely. Why, we could take a swim right now.
Mrs. Bronson, Norma said in a choked voice.
Let's take a swim, Norma, at the bottom of the waterfall. I used to do that when I was a girl. Just sit there and let the water come down on you. Oh, the lovely water,
she murmured as she leaned her face against the burning hot glass.
Oh, the beautiful water. Cool, nice water. The lovely water.
The white-hot rays of the sun clawed at her face. And slowly she began to slump to the floor, leaving a patch of burnt flesh on the window, and then she crumpled in a heap, silently. Norma bent down over her. "Mrs. Bronson?" she said. "Mrs. Bronson?" Norma began to cry. "Oh, Mrs. Bronson!" It happened rather quickly after that. The windows of the buildings began to crack and shatter. The sun was now the whole sky, a vast flaming ceiling that pressed down inexorably. Norma had tried to pick up the gun, but the handle was too hot to touch. Now she knelt in the middle of the room and watched as the paint began to run down the canvases, slow rivulets of thick, sluggish color like diminutive lava streams. After a moment, they burst into flames that licked up the canvases in jagged, hungry assaults. Norma didn't feel the pain when it finally came. She was not aware that her slip had caught fire or that liquid was running out from her eyes. She was a lifeless thing in the middle of an inferno, and there was nothing left inside her throat or mind to allow the scream to come out. Then the building exploded, and the massive sun devoured the entire city. It was black and cold, and an icy frost lay thick on the corners of the window. A doctor with thin lips, his overcoat collar turned high, sat alongside the bed and reached over to touch Norma's forehead. He turned to look across the room at Mrs. Bronson, who stood by the door. "She's coming out of it now," he said quietly. Then he turned back toward the bed. "Miss Smith?" There was a pause. "Miss Smith?" Norma opened her eyes and looked up at him. "Yes," she whispered. "You've been running a very high fever, but I think it's broken now." "Fever?" Mrs. Bronson moved to the bed. "You gave us a start, child. You've been so ill. But you're going to be all right now." She smiled hopefully at the doctor. "Isn't she, Doctor? Isn't she going to be all right?" The doctor didn't smile back. "Of course," he said quietly. Then he rose and motioned to Mrs. Bronson. He tucked the blankets tighter around the girl, picked up his bag, and moved out into the hall where Mrs. Bronson was waiting for him. A cold air whistled up through the landing, and through the window over the stairway, snow came down in heavy, ice-laden gusts. "I hope she'll be all right," the doctor said to Mrs. Bronson. "Just let her sleep as much as she can." He looked down at his bag. "I wish I had something left to give her," he said disconsolately. "But the medicine's pretty much all gone now." He looked toward the window over the landing. "I'm afraid I won't be able to come back. I'm going to try to move my family south tomorrow. A friend of mine has a private plane." Mrs. Bronson's voice was quiet and sad. They say on the radio that Miami is a little warmer." The doctor just looked at her. "So they say." Then he stared at the ice-encrusted window. "But we're just prolonging it. That's all we're doing. Everybody running like scared rabbits to the south. They say that within a week that'll be covered with snow, too." Through the partially open door to Mrs. Bronson's apartment, a radio announcer's voice could be heard. "This is a traffic advisory," the voice said. From the Office of Civil Defense, motorists are advised to stay off the highways on all those routes leading south and west out of New York City. We repeat this advisory: stay off the highways. The doctor picked up his bag and started toward the steps. There was a scientist on this morning, Mrs. Bronson said as she walked beside him. He was trying to explain what happened, how the Earth had changed its orbit and started to move away from the sun. He said that... Her voice became strained. He said that within a week or two, 3 at the most, there wouldn't be any more sun, that we'd all... She gripped her hands together. We'd all freeze. The doctor tried to smile at her, but nothing showed on his face. He looked haggard and old, and his lips were blue as he tightened the scarf around his neck, put on a pair of heavy gloves, and started down the steps. Mrs. Bronson watched him for a moment until he disappeared around the corner of the landing. Then she returned to Norma's room. I had such a terrible dream, Norma said, her eyes half closed. Such an awful dream, Mrs. Bronson. The older woman pulled a chair up closer to the bed. There was daylight all the time. There was a midnight sun. And there wasn't any night at all. No night at all. Her eyes were fully open now, and she smiled. Isn't it wonderful, Mrs. Bronson, to have darkness and coolness? Mrs. Bronson stared into the feverish face and nodded slowly. Yes, my dear, she said softly. It's wonderful. Outside, the snow fell heavier and heavier, and the glass on the thermometer cracked. The mercury had gone down to the very bottom, and there was no place left for it to go. And very slowly, night and cold reached out with frozen fingers to feel the pulse of the city, and then to stop it.